The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the floorboards of her small cottage, creeping through the cracks she was always failing to properly seal with moss and mud. It clung to the damp wool of her blanket and settled deep in her bones, a permanent ache that reminded her she was alive, and that being alive was a kind of punishment. Ember knew cold. She had been born to it, in a way. Not the crisp, clean cold of the northern sea that surrounded her island, but the chilling indifference in her father's eyes, the frosty silence of a home built on shame. Here, in this forgotten corner of the archipelago, the cold was at least honest. It made no pretense of being anything other than what it was. A force that could kill you if you weren't careful. She was careful. Always. The cottage had been a fisher's hut, abandoned for a generation before the king's decree had sent her here. A life of exile for the sins of a father she barely remembered. He was a traitor. She was his daughter. The equation was simple, brutal, and absolute. She survived. She chopped her own wood from the stunted, wind-twisted pines at the edge of the shore. She tended a meager garden in the thin soil, coaxing pale potatoes and tough greens from the earth. She learned the tides and the moods of the gulls. She learned the deep, profound language of loneliness. Then the howling started. It wasn't the sound of the local wolves, the small, scraggly packs that hunted in the high ridges. Their yips and calls were a familiar part of the island's night song. This was different. This was a single voice. A sound so deep and resonant it seemed to vibrate in the very timber of her cottage. It was a cry filled with a longing so profound it scraped against her own solitude, making it feel less like an absence and more like a wound. The first night, she had huddled by the dying embers of her fire, a rusty wood axe clutched in her hands, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had expected the splintering of her door, the crash of a body breaking through the flimsy barrier she called a home. But the attack never came. The howl simply was. It rose, held a note of impossible sorrow, and then faded, leaving a silence that was somehow heavier than the sound had been. The second night, it came again. Closer, it seemed. She peered through a crack in the shutter, her breath fogging the sliver of view. She saw nothing but the gnarled silhouettes of the pines against a sky awash with the cold, distant light of the aurora. But she could feel it. A presence. Something vast and powerful was out there in the dark. On the third night, she found the rabbit. It was laid carefully on her doorstep, its neck broken cleanly, its fur still warm. A gift, not a threat. Her fear, a sharp and familiar thing, began to curdle into confusion. Wild animals did not leave offerings. The howling continued, a nightly vigil, and so did the gifts. A fat silver fish, a branch of rare moon-petal blossoms, their scent a sweet shock in the salty air. A piece of amber, washed smooth by the sea, that glowed with trapped, ancient light. She never took them in at first. She left them for the gulls, telling herself it was a trap, a trick of some kind. But her gaze would linger on them, on the clear intent behind them. Someone, or something, was trying to speak to her in the only language it knew. Who would do this? The villagers in the island's only settlement, a day's walk away, wanted nothing to do with the trader's daughter. They crossed the path to avoid her, their faces hard masks of suspicion. It wasn't them. It was the wolf. It had to be. The great solitary wolf whose voice held the sorrow of a winter without end. 1 week turned into 2. The howl became a part of her evenings, as familiar as the cry of the seabirds or the crackle of her fire. The fear had been scoured away, replaced by a gnawing curiosity that was almost as painful. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. It felt like hope, and hope was a dangerous, treacherous thing. She started talking to it, her voice a low whisper that barely disturbed the air in her small room. "Why are you here?" she asked the shuttered window. "What do you want from me?" The only answer was the long, mournful cry that seemed to hold the same questions. Then came the storm. It wasn't a usual squall. This was a true northern gale, a monster of wind and water that threw the sea against the cliffs and screamed through the pines. The walls of her cottage groaned, the roof tiles rattled like bones, and through the din, she heard it, the howl. But this time it was different. It was ragged, torn by pain. Something inside her, a core of hard-packed survival instinct that had kept her alive for years, cracked. She thought of the gifts, the warmth of the rabbit fur, the sweet scent of the flowers. She thought of the profound loneliness in that sound, a mirror to her own. Before she could second-guess the madness of it, Ember unbarred the door. The wind ripped it from her grasp, slamming it back against the wall with a deafening crack. Rain and sea spray lashed her face, stinging her eyes. And there he was. He was enormous, larger than any wolf had a right to be. His fur was the color of charcoal and shadow, matted and dark with rain. He was lying on his side, his great chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. A thick branch, sharp as a spear, was embedded deep in his shoulder, and a dark stain was spreading from the wound, even in the torrential downpour. His eyes found hers. They were not the yellow of a common wolf. They were a strange, pale silver, like the heart of a winter moon. And in their depths, she saw not the savagery of a beast, but an intelligence that was shockingly, terrifyingly human. There was pain, yes, but there was also recognition. He didn't growl. He didn't move, other than a faint, pleading whine that was lost in the wind's shriek. He was dying, on her doorstep. The cold that had been her constant companion was forgotten, burned away by a sudden, fierce heat in her chest. "You stupid beast," she whispered, the words whipped away by the gale. "You stupid, magnificent beast." She grabbed the edge of the door, fighting the wind to pull it half closed, creating a small shelter from the worst of the storm. Then, without another thought for her own safety, she went to him. Getting him inside was a nightmare. He was a dead weight of muscle and wet fur, heavier than she could have imagined. She heaved and pulled, her muscles screaming in protest, the rough fur scraping her hands raw. He tried to help, pushing weakly with his hind legs, his silver eyes never leaving her face. Finally, she dragged him over the threshold, his massive form filling the small space between her hearth and her table. She slammed the door against the storm and dropped the bar, her body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. The cottage was suddenly small, crowded with the scent of wet animal, blood, and the wild ozone tang of the storm he'd brought in with him. He lay on the floor, panting, his silver eyes tracking her every move. The branch in his shoulder looked even worse in the flickering firelight. It had gone deep. "All right," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She was talking to a wolf, a giant, bleeding wolf. She was either the bravest woman on the islands or the most foolish. "All right. Let's see about this." She approached him slowly, her hands held out where he could see them. He watched her, his head low, but made no sound of protest. "This is going to hurt," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She knelt beside him, the heat radiating from his body, a startling contrast to the room's chill. His fur was coarse under her hesitant fingers. She could feel the violent tremor of his pain. Her own past was a litany of hurts. She knew pain. She knew the sharp, quick kind and the slow, grinding sort. This, she could understand. She took a deep breath, gripped the slick wood of the branch with both hands, and pulled. A roar of agony was torn from his throat, a sound so visceral it shook the very foundations of the cottage. He thrashed once, his powerful legs scrabbling against the floorboards, but he did not snap at her. His silver eyes squeezed shut, and a low, guttural moan escaped his lips. The branch came free with a sickening squelch. Blood, dark and thick, welled up immediately, pouring from the wound. "No, no, no," she chanted, pressing her hands against the gash. The blood was hot, shockingly so, and it soaked her sleeves in seconds. It wasn't enough. He was bleeding too much. She scrambled for her meager supplies, the clean rag she used for her own cuts, the jar of moss poultice she made every autumn. It was meant for scrapes and scratches, not a wound that looked like it had been carved by a sword. She worked frantically, pressing the poultice into the wound, packing it tight with rags. The wolf lay unnervingly still, his breathing growing shallower. His beautiful silver eyes were becoming cloudy, unfocused. He was slipping away. After all of it, the howling, the gifts, the vigil, he was going to die on her floor. A strange, defiant rage rose in her. No, she would not allow it. She had been a victim of fate and kings and the cruelty of men her entire life. She had accepted her lot, her exile, her loneliness. But this creature had sought her out. It had chosen her, and she would not let it be taken from her. "You don't get to die," she snarled at the great beast, her hand still pressed to his shoulder. "Do you hear me? You came to my door. You don't get to die now." She didn't know what she was doing. An instinct she didn't recognize took over. She leaned closer, her own exhaustion a distant hum. She felt for the life in him, the fading spark she had seen in his eyes. And she pushed back. Not with her hands, not with her body, with her will. She poured all her loneliness, all her stubborn refusal to break, all her fury at the unfairness of the world into a single, silent command. Live. A warmth bloomed under her palms. It wasn't the heat of his blood, it was something else. A soft, gentle light, the color of dawn, seeped from her skin, flowing into the dark fur. It was faint, barely visible in the firelight, but she could feel it. A tingling energy that wasn't hers and yet came from her. The wolf's breathing hitched. His eyes, which had been closing, snapped open, the cloudy film gone. They were fixed on her face, wide with a dawning astonishment that mirrored her own. Under her hands, she felt the flesh begin to knit together. The terrible, gaping wound seemed to shrink, the edges drawing closed as if stitched by an invisible needle. The flow of blood slowed, then stopped. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving her dizzy and breathless. She slumped back on her heels, staring at her own hands. They were just hands, calloused, stained with dirt and blood, but ordinary. What had she just done? The wolf stirred. He lifted his head, his neck strong and sure again. He looked at his shoulder, now just a puckered, angry scar instead of a fatal wound. Then he looked back at her. He let out a soft whine and nudged his great head under her hand, pressing his cheek against her arm in a gesture of unmistakable gratitude. His fur was dry now and soft. Ember stared at him, her heart pounding a new, unfamiliar rhythm. The storm still raged outside, but inside her little cottage, the world had shifted on its axis. The wolf was real. The wound was real. And the light. The light had been real too. She was the daughter of a traitor, an exile, a pariah. She was nothing. But she had just saved the life of a creature of myth and shadow, with a power she hadn't known she possessed. The wolf settled by the hearth, laying his head on his paws, his silver eyes never leaving her. He wasn't her captive. He was her guest. And in his gaze, for the first time in her life, Ember did not see pity or contempt or fear. She saw awe. He stayed for 3 days. The storm passed, leaving the island scrubbed clean and glistening. The wolf, who she began to think of simply as Wolf, did not leave. He was a quiet companion. He would lie by the fire while she did her chores, his presence a warm, solid weight in the small space. He followed her when she went to gather wood, staying at the edge of the tree line, a silent, watchful guardian. She found herself talking to him, filling the silence she had lived in for years. She told him about the different types of seaweed, about the way the frost settled on the windows in the deep winter, about the book of myths her mother had read to her as a small child, before everything had gone wrong. He would listen, his head cocked, his silver eyes seeming to understand more than any animal should. The light did not return. She would stare at her hands, trying to summon that feeling, that warmth. But there was nothing. It was as if it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by fear and desperation. But the scar on his shoulder was real, and the way he looked at her was real. On the morning of the fourth day, she awoke to find him gone. A sharp, surprising pang of loss hit her. The cottage felt empty, the silence once again heavy and unwelcome. She had grown used to his steady breathing, the sheer size of him filling her world. On the doorstep, where the rabbit had once been, was a single, perfect feather from a sea eagle. It was a farewell. She told herself it was for the best. He was a wild creature. She was an exile. Their worlds were not meant to intersect. But as she went about her day, her eyes kept straying to the empty space by the hearth. That evening, a man came to her door. It was just before dusk. She was mending a fishing net by the fire when the knock came. It was a firm, solid sound, nothing like the whisper of the wind or the scrabble of a stray animal. It was a human knock. Her blood ran cold. No one ever came to her door. She grabbed the iron poker from the hearth, her knuckles white. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice thin. "My name is Voss." A deep voice answered from the other side. It was a voice that seemed to vibrate through the wood of the door, much like the wolf's howl had. "I'm the new warden for this sector. I was told to check on all the island's inhabitants." A warden, a king's man. Her throat went dry. Wardens meant questions, reports, scrutiny. They meant trouble. "There's no need," she said, her voice tight. "I'm fine." "I'm required to see for myself," the voice insisted. It wasn't harsh, but it held an undeniable authority. "The storm was severe. I need to confirm you have shelter and supplies." She was trapped. Refusing a king's warden was as good as admitting guilt, though what she would be guilty of she didn't know. With a trembling hand, she lifted the bar and opened the door a crack. The man standing outside took her breath away. He was tall, broader than the doorframe, dressed in dark, practical leathers that had seen much wear. His hair was as black as the wolf's fur, pulled back from a face that was all harsh lines and stark angles. It was a predator's face, made for command, not for smiling. He looked like he had been carved from the island's own granite cliffs. And his eyes. His eyes were the color of a winter moon. Pale, startling silver. Ember's heart stopped. She stared from his eyes to the faint puckered scar she could just see on the exposed skin above the collar of his tunic. A scar that was the exact shape and in the exact place as the one she had healed on the wolf. It was impossible. It was madness. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment the harshness of his face softened, a flicker of something she couldn't name. Relief? Recognition? Warmed his silver gaze. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice softer now. "The wind is cold." She couldn't speak. She could only nod, stepping back from the door like a sleepwalker. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial and dawning, terrifying belief. He stepped inside, and the cottage seemed to shrink around him, just as it had with the wolf. He moved with a quiet, contained grace that was unnervingly familiar. He glanced around the small room, his eyes lingering on the eagle feather she had tucked into a crack in the mantelpiece, then on the empty space by the hearth. "You're Ember," he stated. It wasn't a question. "You're the warden," she managed to say, her voice a croak. "Voss," he corrected gently. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she felt as exposed as if he could see every thought, every fear, every secret she possessed. "I heard you were living here alone. I was concerned." Concerned? No one had been concerned for her in a decade. "I manage," she said, clutching the poker tighter. It felt flimsy and useless in her hand. He noticed her grip, and his mouth tightened into a thin line. He made no move to disarm her, but he held his own hands out, open and empty. "I don't mean you any harm, Ember." She wanted to scream at him. "Who are you? What are you?" But the words were locked in her throat. If she said it aloud, it would become real. The man and the wolf, the wound and the scar, the magic she had performed without understanding it. "Why are you really here, Warden?" she asked instead, forcing a coldness into her tone that she did not feel. His silver eyes held hers. "The storm was bad. I am checking on my people." His people. The words hung in the air. She was not one of his people. She was a traitor's daughter, an outcast. "I am not your people," she said, the words sharp with years of bitterness. A flicker of pain crossed his face, so quick she almost missed it. "Perhaps not," he conceded, his voice quiet. "But you are living on this land. That makes you my responsibility." He stayed, citing the coming darkness and the treacherous paths. She didn't have the strength or the will to force him out. She made a thin stew from potatoes and dried fish, and they ate in a tense silence, sitting at her small table. He ate with a focused intensity, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in days. She found herself watching his hands. They were large, calloused, but they moved with a surprising gentleness as he handled the rough-hewn bowl and spoon. She couldn't stop looking at the scar. It was undeniable. "How did you get that?" she asked suddenly, her voice louder than she intended. She pointed with her spoon towards his neck. He froze, his hand halfway to his mouth. He slowly lowered his spoon, and his fingers went to the scar, a self-conscious gesture that seemed out of place on such a formidable man. "A hunting accident," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It looks recent," she pressed, unable to stop herself. "It was," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "And it would have been fatal, if not for an unexpected kindness." The air crackled between them. He knew. He knew that she knew, but neither of them would say it. It was a secret they were now forced to share, a fragile, dangerous bridge between them. He did not sleep by the fire. He insisted on sleeping outside the door, claiming he preferred the open air. "I'll keep watch," he said, and she knew he wasn't talking about common animals or bandits. He was standing guard. For her. That night, for the first time in weeks, there was no howl. There was only the steady, comforting presence of the man on the other side of her door, a guardian against the darkness. And Ember, for the first time in years, did not feel cold. Voss became a fixture in her life, as constant as the tides. He never called himself anything but the Warden, and she never called him anything but Voss. The lie stood between them, a silent, unacknowledged wall. He used his duties as an excuse, a thin veil for his true purpose. He would appear at her cottage at the end of the day, a brace of rabbits or a string of fish in hand. "A surplus from the king's lands," he'd say, his face impassive. "It's my duty to see it's distributed." He never mentioned that she was the only one receiving this royal bounty. He fixed her roof, replacing the broken tiles with steady, competent hands. He reinforced the shutters until they closed with a satisfying thud, no longer rattling in the wind. He dug a new drainage ditch around her garden, his powerful body moving with an easy rhythm that made her breath catch in her throat. He was turning her place of exile into a home. She fought it. She fought him. "I don't need your help," she'd say, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I have managed on my own for years." "I have no doubt," he would reply, his silver eyes gentle. But you don't have to. His presence was an invasion. It broke the hard, protective shell she had built around her heart. With him here, the loneliness she had learned to live with became sharp and painful again, because his company showed her what she was missing. She would watch him, trying to reconcile the man with the wolf. The man was quiet, reserved, his words few but carefully chosen. He moved with a purposefulness that spoke of immense, restrained power. The wolf had been wild, instinctual, its sorrow a raw, open thing. Yet, they were the same. She saw it in the way his eyes tracked the flight of a gull, a predator's focus in the warden's gaze. She saw it in the way he would sometimes stand at the edge of the cliffs, his head thrown back, seeming to taste the wind. And she saw it in the way he looked at her. He watched her with a fierce, unwavering intensity. It wasn't the leering gaze of the guards who had escorted her into exile, nor the fearful, pitying glances of the villagers. It was something else entirely. It was possessive, protective. It was the way the wolf had looked at her after she had saved him. One afternoon, a group of village boys, emboldened by their numbers, came to her cottage. They threw rocks at her windows, their cruel, jeering laughter echoing in the quiet clearing. "Traitor's witch!" they yelled. "Beast sorceress!" Ember froze inside, the familiar, sick feeling of shame and fear washing over her. She just had to wait them out. They would get bored and leave. But then Voss appeared. He seemed to materialize from the woods, moving with a speed that was not entirely human. He didn't run. He flowed. He didn't shout. He didn't touch them. He simply stood before them, his sheer size a threat in itself. He looked at the boys, his silver eyes gone cold and flat as a frozen lake. He said one word: "Leave." It was not a request. It was a command that resonated with an ancient, absolute authority. The boys scattered like frightened birds, their taunts dying in their throats. Voss watched them go, his body rigid. Then he turned to her. He saw the broken shutter, the fear still lingering in her eyes. The coldness in his own gaze was replaced by a burning, protective fury. "They will not bother you again," he said, and it was a vow. The external siege had begun. Whispers from the village grew louder. The strange, solitary warden was spending all his time with the traitor's daughter. Had she bewitched him? What dark magic was she working in that isolated cottage? Messengers began to arrive from the capital on the main island, stern-faced men in the king's livery, carrying sealed scrolls. They would speak with Voss in low, urgent tones, their eyes cutting to Ember with open hostility. Voss would listen, his face a granite mask. His replies were always short, dismissive. After they left, a new tension would settle in his shoulders, a weight she could almost see. "What do they want?" she asked him once, after a particularly grim-faced captain had departed. "Matters of state," he said, his voice clipped. "Things that don't concern you." The words were a slap. They put her back in her place, the exile, the outsider. She turned away from him, the hurt a sharp sting. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder before dropping back to his side. "Ember," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. "It is better that you are not concerned. I am trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" she cried, whirling back to face him. "From whispers? From matters of state? Or from yourself?" The question hung between them, dangerous and sharp. "What are you, Voss?" she whispered, the words she had suppressed for so long finally breaking free. "You are not just a warden, and you were not just a wolf." He looked at her, and the mask of the stoic warden fell away. In his eyes, she saw the same profound loneliness she had first heard in the wolf's howl, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "I am," he began, his voice cracking. "I am a man under a curse, Ember. A curse that has defined my entire life. He told her then. Not everything. Not the part about being a king. But he told her about the beast within him, a power he could barely control. He told her of the curse laid on his bloodline centuries ago by a vengeful witch, a curse of loneliness. My family cannot know love, he said, his voice flat with ancient pain. The moment we allow that feeling, the moment we bond with another, the curse takes root. It twists our strength into a weakness. It devours us from the inside out. Love will kill me, he said, the words simple, direct, and utterly devastating. And I am saying that I love you and it's going to kill me. The title-worthy line, the confession. She stared at him, her world tilting on its axis. He loved her. This impossible, cursed man-wolf loved her, and that love was a death sentence. You can't, she stammered, taking a step back. You don't even know me. I have known you for 100 lifetimes, he said, his silver eyes burning with a desperate intensity. I have been searching for you, Ember. My wolf knew you the moment it caught your scent on the wind. My soul knew you the moment I saw you. He explained how the bond, the fated connection between them, had drawn him here. He had fought it. He had tried to stay away, knowing that getting close to her would doom him. But the pull was irresistible. The howling had been his attempt to warn her, to scare her away. When that failed, it had become a plea. And then you opened the door, he whispered. You let the monster in, and you healed it. Her strange, forgotten power. He believed it was the only thing that had kept the curse at bay so far. Her light was fighting his darkness. But for how long? The pieces fell into place. His constant presence wasn't just desire. It was a desperate need to be near the only thing that soothed the curse. The external pressures, the messengers, the political crises. They weren't just distractions. They were threats that sought to pull him away from her, and in doing so, sentence him to death. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her anger a shield against the terror and the overwhelming tenderness she felt for him. How could I? He asked, a bitter laugh escaping him. Do I tell you I am the beast that haunted your nights? Do I tell you that your very presence is the only thing keeping me sane, but that my love for you is a poison that will inevitably destroy me? What choice does that give you? He was right. It gave her no choice at all, because she was already lost. Looking at him, at this man who was a king in all but name, who carried a world of sorrow in his eyes, she knew she had been lost from the moment she opened her door to the storm. The fragile peace of their shared secret was shattered by the arrival of a royal barge. It was not a messenger's skiff, but a grand, imposing vessel with the Alpha King's banner, a silver wolf on a field of black, whipping in the wind. Ember's blood ran cold. The wolf on the banner was him. The silver eyes, the powerful form. It was all there. Voss was not just a warden. Voss was the king, the Alpha King, the man whose father had sentenced her father to death. The man who had confirmed her exile, the ruler of the very system that had branded her worthless. The revelation hit her not with a spark, but with the force of a physical blow. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The lies. All of it. Every careful omission. Every half-truth. He wasn't just a man with a curse. He was a king hiding his crown. A delegation of grim-faced men in silver-inlaid armor marched up the path to her cottage. At their head was an older, severe-looking man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes as cold as the northern sea. His name was Lord Kalin, the king's chancellor, a man whose name was whispered with fear even in the farthest islands. Voss met them outside, positioning his body between them and her door. He was no longer the quiet warden. He stood taller, his shoulders broader. The immense authority he usually kept contained now rolled off him in palpable waves. He was every inch the king. Your Majesty, Kalen said, his voice dripping with disapproval as his eyes flickered to Ember, who was visible in the doorway. We have indulged this retreat for long enough. The council is restless. The emissaries from the Sunstone clans demand an answer. Your duty is in the capital. My duty is where I say it is, Kalen. Voss's voice was low, a dangerous growl that promised violence. Is your duty to the traitor's daughter? Kalen shot back, his voice rising. He pointed a gauntleted finger at Ember. The spawn of the man who tried to shatter this kingdom? Have you forgotten what her bloodline represents? She has bewitched you, Your Majesty. This is the work of her father's lingering poison. The words were for the guards, for the council, for the whole world to hear. They were designed to shame, to isolate, to sever. Ember felt the stares of the guards like physical blows. Witch, traitor, seductress. She could see the words in their eyes. The old familiar shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to run back into the darkness of her cottage and bar the door forever. But then she looked at Voss. He hadn't turned. He hadn't flinched. His entire being was focused on defending her, a living shield against the world's hatred. He was dying because he loved her. And here they were, trying to rip him away from his only salvation. And that's when the rage came. It was not a hot, screaming rage. It was a cold, silent, incandescent fury. A rage against Kalen, against the guards, against the king who had condemned her, the father who had shamed her, the world that had decided she was worthless before she had ever drawn a breath. A rage against the injustice of it all. Enough, she said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the tense standoff like a shard of glass. Everyone turned to look at her. Kalen's face held contemptuous surprise. The guards looked confused. Voss finally turned his head, his silver eyes wide with alarm. Ember, go inside, he commanded, his voice strained. No, she said, and stepped out of the cottage, out from behind his protection. She walked until she stood beside him, facing the Chancellor and his armored retinue. She was small and plainly dressed next to their finery, but she did not feel small. You speak of my blood, she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating with a power she didn't know she had. You speak of my father's sins. I have lived in the shadow of those sins my entire life. I have paid for his crimes with my solitude, with my shame, with my silence. She looked at each guard, one by one, her gaze unflinching. But my silence ends today. She turned to Kalen. You call your king bewitched. You call me a witch. You see a man's love for a woman and can only name it as a weakness, a spell, a poison. It is you who are blind, my lord. You see a crown and a curse. I see a man. As she spoke, the air around her began to shimmer. The familiar warmth she had felt once before bloomed in her chest, but this time it was not a gentle flicker. It was a furnace. A soft golden light began to emanate from her, pushing back the gray gloom of the northern afternoon. Ember, no! Voss gasped, reaching for her, his face a mask of terror. He knew what a public display of this power would mean. They would call it proof of her witchcraft. But she couldn't stop it. Her rage, her defiance, her love for the man standing beside her. It was all fuel for this strange inner fire. She is the witch I spoke of, Kalen roared, pointing at her. Seize her! The king is not in his right mind. We must save him from her. The guards hesitated, their hands on their swords, looking from their enraged chancellor to their silent king, to the woman who was now glowing like the dawn. That hesitation, that moment of public humiliation and judgment, was the final key. Her rage at their injustice, their willful blindness, erupted. The light exploded from her. It wasn't an attack. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated truth. a wave of soul energy that slammed into everyone in the clearing. It carried no heat, no force, but it struck them harder than any physical blow. It stripped away the lies. The guards staggered back, their faces suddenly etched with their own hidden shames, their petty jealousies, their secret fears. Kalen cried out and fell to his knees, clutching his head as if the light was a physical poison, forcing him to confront the bitter ambition that festered beneath his veneer of loyalty. The light washed over Voss, but it did not harm him. Instead, it sank into him. She felt it connect with the darkness of his curse, not fighting it, but surrounding it, illuminating it, showing it for the ancient, hollow thing it was. A deep, shuddering groan escaped his lips, a sound of both agony and release. The tension in his body broke, and he sagged, his strength failing. He was falling. The political crisis, the threat to the kingdom, Kalen's accusations. It had all been a symptom of the true disease, the witch's curse. And now, the emotional turmoil had activated it fully. Voss collapsed. Not like a man fainting, but like a statue of ice shattering. A deep, unnatural cold emanated from him, frosting the ground where he fell. His skin, where Ember could see it, was turning a pale, bloodless white. The scar on his neck stood out, a dark slash against the encroaching frost. "Voss!" she screamed, the light around her flickering as her concentration broke. She scrambled to his side, ignoring the groaning chancellor and the terrified guards. She touched his face. It was like touching marble. Cold. So cold. His silver eyes were open but vacant, staring at a sky only he could see. A thin layer of frost was forming on his eyelashes. The curse was consuming him, turning him to ice from the inside out. Her light had revealed the curse, but in doing so, it had pushed it to its final, desperate act. It was killing him. "Get the royal healer!" One of the guards finally stammered, shaking himself free of the light's after effects. "It's no use," Kalen rasped from the ground, his face pale and clammy. "This is the blood curse. No healer can touch it. It has finally taken him. The witch has killed her king." Ember didn't hear him. She was cradling Voss's head in her lap, her hands on his frozen cheeks. She could feel the life in him, the powerful spirit of the wolf, being extinguished, smothered under a mountain of magical ice. She tried to summon the light again, to pour her warmth into him, but her panic and fear were a wall. The power wouldn't answer. It had been born of righteous fury, and now all she felt was a deep, soul-crushing despair. The guards formed a circle around them, their faces grim. They were watching their king die. They were watching her, the traitor's daughter, the witch, hold him as he died. She had to save him. The thought was a single burning point in the fog of her grief. He had come for her. He had guarded her door. He had loved her, and it had cost him everything. She couldn't heal him with the light. Not like this. The curse was too old, too strong. It was a part of him, woven into his blood. Fighting it head-on was like trying to fight the tide. She had to go with it. An old story, one her mother had read to her from the Book of Myths, surfaced in her mind. A story of a sun queen and a winter king, of a love so strong it could melt the eternal ice. It was a fairy tale, but so was a man who was also a wolf. So was a girl who could glow with light. The story said the Winter King could only be saved if the Sun Queen chose to share his fate. Not to fight his winter, but to enter it with him. It was a choice, a sacrifice. She looked down at Voss's frozen face, at the man who was both her king and her wolf. She had opened her door for him. She would not let him die alone in the cold. "I choose you, Voss," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "In life and in death, in warmth and in cold." She closed her eyes, shutting out the fearful faces of the guards and the gray sky. She stopped fighting the cold that radiated from him. Instead, she invited it in. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her cheek against his, and let the supernatural frost crawl over her skin. It was an agony beyond description. It was a cold that burned, sinking into her flesh, her bones, her very soul. It was the feeling of life being systematically extinguished. She felt her own heart begin to slow, her breath turning to ice in her lungs. She was dying, and she had chosen it. But as the last of her warmth faded, as the darkness of the curse closed in, something shifted. Her acceptance of the curse, her willingness to share his fate, it was not the surrender the ancient magic expected. It was an act of ultimate defiance, an act of perfect, unconditional love. And it was the trigger. The light didn't erupt this time. It was born in the deepest, coldest part of her, in the space where her life was about to end. It was not a fire fighting the ice. It was a seed of spring buried under the deepest snow, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Her choice, her sacrifice, was that moment. A single word of power bloomed in her mind, a word she had never heard but had always known. It was his true name, not the one a king uses, but the one a soul carries. She breathed it into his ear, a whisper of pure light against the encroaching ice. The effect was instantaneous. The cold did not retreat. It shattered. A wave of warmth, of life, of pure golden light exploded from the point where they touched. It was not her light or his power, but something new, something forged in the crucible of their shared sacrifice. It was the light of their bond made manifest. The wave of energy washed over the clearing, but this time it wasn't an accusation. It was a benediction. The frost on the ground vanished. The fear on the guards' faces was replaced by pure, unadulterated awe. Kalen stared, his mouth agape, as centuries of cynical belief turned to dust. Ember felt the warmth flood back into her own body, chasing away the deathly chill. She gasped, her lungs filling with sweet, clean air. She looked down. Voss's color was returning. The deathly pallor was replaced by the healthy flush of life. The frost on his lashes melted into what looked like tears. His chest rose and fell with a deep, steady breath. His silver eyes opened. The vacancy was gone. They were clear, sharp, and filled with a love so immense it stole the air from her lungs. He reached up, his hand no longer cold, and cupped her cheek. The scar above his collar was gone. Not healed, but simply gone, as if it had never been. The curse had been scoured from his blood. "Ember," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She just sobbed, a great wrenching sound of relief and joy. She was alive. He was alive. They were alive. He pulled her down to him, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that was all human, all man. He held her as if he would never let her go. "It's gone," he murmured into her hair. "The cold, the silence. It's all gone. You did it. We did it," she corrected, her voice muffled against his chest. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his silver eyes shining. "I love you," he said. And for the first time, the words were not a death sentence. They were a promise, a beginning. "I know," she whispered, a real smile, her first in years, spreading across her face. "I love you too, my stubborn wolf." He laughed, a rich, full sound that seemed to shake the last of the winter from the world. He leaned in and kissed her, and it was not the kiss of a king to a subject, or a man to a woman he just met. It was the kiss of two souls who had found each other in the dark and had walked through fire and ice to be together. Around them, the king's guards, his most hardened warriors, fell to one knee. Not in supplication to their king, but in reverence for their new queen, the woman who had saved him, the queen of light who had chosen their winter king and melted his curse with her love. Months later, the northern sun streamed through the tall, arched windows of the royal bedchamber in the capital's silver spire. It was a softer sun than the one she was used to. Its light filtered through the sea mist that often clung to the capital island. Ember stretched, the silk sheets cool against her skin. She turned her head on the pillow and watched the man sleeping beside her. Voss, her husband, her king. In sleep, the lines of command and sorrow were smoothed from his face. He looked younger, more peaceful than she had ever imagined he could be. The curse had not just been a threat, it had been a constant weight, and its absence had transformed him. The deep, pervasive cold was gone from him, replaced by a steady, radiating warmth that she loved to curl up against in the night. She reached out, tracing the spot where the scar had been. The skin was smooth and unblemished. Her light, their bond, had not just healed him, it had remade him. It had remade them both. She was no longer Ember, the traitor's daughter, the exile. She was the queen, the Sun Queen, the people had started calling her. Her power, once a terrifying secret, was now a celebrated gift. It flowed from her not in explosive bursts, but in a steady, gentle warmth that seemed to soothe the old wounds of the kingdom. Voss stirred, his silver eyes opening. They found her immediately, as they always did, and a slow smile spread across his face. "You're staring," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm admiring," she corrected, leaning in to kiss him. "My king is handsome in the morning light." "My queen is beautiful in any light," he countered, pulling her close. His arms were a circle of safety and strength she now knew as home. They lay there for a while, in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand one another. The world outside, with its duties and politics, could wait. These mornings were theirs, stolen moments of peace that they both treasured. The kingdom had been in an uproar after the events at her cottage. Lord Kalin, humbled and profoundly changed, had been the first to swear fealty to her, his new queen. He had become her most staunch supporter on the council, his sharp mind now dedicated to integrating her into the fabric of the kingdom instead of tearing her away. As for the witch who had started it all, the resolution had been as unexpected as everything else. Following the breaking of the curse, Voss had felt the ancient magic unravel. It led them to a hidden cove on the most remote of the islands, where they found not a monster, but a woman, ancient beyond measure, her own power faded to a mere echo. Her name was Lyra, and she had been the sister of the queen a previous king in Voss's line had cast aside for political gain. Lyra's sister had died of a broken heart, and in her grief, Lyra had cursed the king's bloodline to know the same loneliness. She had not meant for it to last for centuries, a self-perpetuating cycle of pain. She was as much a prisoner of the curse as they were. Ember, looking at the witch's grief-hollowed eyes, saw not a villain, but a mirror of her own past loneliness. She had not offered punishment. She had offered forgiveness. She had used her light not to destroy the last of the witch's magic, but to gently untangle it from the grief that bound it, setting the old woman free. Lyra had wept, and then, with the first peace she had known in centuries, had passed into dust on the sea wind. A soft knock on the chamber door brought Ember back to the present. "Enter," Voss called, his voice holding its familiar note of command, but softened now at the edges. A young servant girl entered, her eyes downcast, and curtsied deeply. "Your Majesties, the delegation from the Sunstone clans has arrived." The Sunstone clans, the very people whose demands had precipitated the crisis. They had been allies of her father, and they had seen Voss's union with her as the ultimate betrayal. Ember felt a flicker of the old apprehension, but Voss squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "We will see them together," he said, his voice a quiet promise. Later, in the great hall, they stood before the throne, not on it, beside it, equals. They faced the grim-faced clan leaders, their expressions a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. Ember stepped forward. She wore a simple gown of deep blue, the color of the twilight sea, with no crown or jewels. Her only adornment was the light that seemed to glow faintly from within her. "Chiefs of the Sunstone clans," she began, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "You knew my father. You knew his anger and his pride. I am his daughter and I carry his blood, but I am not his ghost." She looked at Voss, and the love that passed between them was a tangible thing in the hall. "The divisions of the past have cost our people enough. This king, my husband, has chosen a new path, a path of unity, of healing." She held out her hands. "I am not asking you to forget the past. I am asking you to build a future with us, a future where a daughter is not judged by the sins of her father, and a king is not a prisoner of his curse." A murmur went through the hall. The clan leaders looked at each other, then at the united front of their king and queen. They saw the strength of the bond between them, a power greater than any army. Slowly, one by one, they bent the knee. That night, as the moon cast a silver path across the sea, Ember and Voss stood on the balcony overlooking the capital. The city lights twinkled below, a constellation of their own. "Are you happy, Ember?" Voss asked quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her head. She leaned back into his warmth, her heart full. She thought of the cold, lonely girl in the fisher's hut, who had thought her life was over. She thought of the magnificent wolf howling in the darkness, his sorrow a song she understood. "I have never been happier," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You opened a door in me, Voss, just as I opened mine for you." He turned her in his arms, his silver eyes glowing with love. "Then I suppose we have a lot of open doors to look forward to." And as he kissed her, under the light of the moon, she knew that their story wasn't a fairy tale that had ended. It was one that had just begun. The cold was finally and truly gone, replaced by a warmth that promised to last a lifetime.